The red earth of Ouagadougou still trembled from the morning's heat when the black Mercedes convoys rolled through the gates of the presidential compound. Dust clouds rose like ancient spirits disturbed from their slumber, swirling around the armored vehicles that carried men whose names had been whispered in both reverence and fear across the Sahel for decades. General Kwame Asante stepped out first, his polished boots striking the laterite ground with the authority of a man who had commanded armies since before Ibrahim Traore was born. The Ghanaian's uniform bore more medals than a museum display, each one a testament to battles fought in the name of democracy, stability, and, though he would never admit it, the interests of powers far beyond Africa's shores. Behind him emerged General Mamadou Diallo from Senegal, his weathered face carrying the scars of conflicts that had raged from Mali to Chad. The man's eyes held the coldness of harmattan winds, sharp and cutting. General Moses Nyong from Cameroon followed, his massive frame casting shadows that seemed to swallow smaller men whole. Last came General Fatima al-Rashid from Niger, her hijab pristine white against her olive-green uniform, her presence commanding respect even from those who questioned a woman's place in military leadership. These were the titans of West African military might, the kingmakers who had toppled governments and installed presidents with the casual ease of chess players moving pieces across a board. Today they had come to Burkina Faso with an ultimatum for its young captain president, Ibrahim Traore. The acacia trees lining the compound's pathways whispered warnings in the hot wind, their thorns catching fragments of conversation as the general's entourages moved through the complex. Servants and guards alike dropped their eyes, sensing the weight of history pressing down upon this sun-baked afternoon. Inside the presidential palace, Ibrahim Traore sat in meditation. At 34, he looked even younger, his face unmarked by the cynicism that had etched deep lines into the features of his visitors. His military fatigues were simple, clean but unadorned. No medals gleamed on his chest, only the red, white and green patch of Burkina Faso, the land of upright men. "Captain," whispered Colonel Diallo, his aide-de-camp, "they have arrived." Traore's eyes opened slowly, like a man emerging from communion with ancestors. He had been speaking with his grandmother in his heart, feeling her weathered hands upon his shoulders, hearing her voice carried on winds that had blown across this land since before the white man's maps had carved it into arbitrary nations. "Yamba," he murmured in Moor, the greeting that meant more than hello. It meant recognition of shared humanity, shared struggle, shared destiny. The conference room had been prepared according to protocol, with flags arranged in perfect order and water glasses filled with precision. But as the generals filed in, the space seemed to shrink, charged with the electricity of confrontation. The walls, painted in cream and gold, bore portraits of Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary who had renamed this country from Upper Volta to Burkina Faso, the land of upright men, before his assassination in 1987. General Asante took his seat at the head of the polished mahogany table, his fingers drumming against the wood with the rhythm of a military march. "Captain Traore," he began, his accent carrying the educated inflections of Sandhurst and St. Cyr, "we come as brothers, as fellow Africans concerned about the stability of our region." Traore nodded respectfully, his hands folded before him. Around the table, the other generals arranged themselves like judges preparing to deliver a verdict. The air conditioning hummed, but it could not cool the heat of tension that radiated from every corner of the room. "Your activities," General Diallo continued, his French crisp and formal, "have created ripples across West Africa. The suspension of French mining operations, the expulsion of military advisors, the rejection of ECOWAS protocols, these actions concern our partners." The word partners hung in the air like incense, heavy with implications. Everyone in the room understood the euphemism. The true partners were not African. They sat in offices in Paris, Washington, and London, men in expensive suits who moved African resources across global markets with the same ease their ancestors had moved African bodies across the Atlantic. General Nyong's voice rumbled like distant thunder. "Young man, you play a dangerous game. Do you think you are the first to speak of sovereignty? Of African dignity? We have seen revolutionaries come and go. They burn bright, then they burn out." The reference to burning was not accidental. Every person in that room remembered what had happened to revolutionaries who had pushed too hard, too fast. Sankara's blood had watered this same earth. Lumumba's dreams had died on Congolese soil. Nkrumah had died in exile, his Pan-African vision seemingly buried with him. General al-Rashid leaned forward, her voice soft but carrying the authority of desert winds. "Captain, we offer you a path to legitimacy. Accept the ECOWAS framework. Restore the mining agreements. Allow the return of peacekeeping forces. In return, we guarantee your government's recognition and protection. The ultimatum had been delivered with diplomatic language, but its meaning was crystal clear. Comply or face the consequences that had befallen other African leaders who had dared to chart independent courses. Traore listened in silence, his dark eyes moving from face to face, reading the mixture of condescension, concern, and barely concealed threat in their expressions. Behind their words, he heard the echoes of colonial masters speaking to colonial subjects, the familiar pattern of African leaders being summoned to receive instructions disguised as advice. When they finished speaking, silence filled the room like morning mist over the Volta River. The generals waited, expecting the young captain to request time to consider their proposal, to ask for clarification, to begin the familiar dance of negotiation that would ultimately lead to his capitulation. Instead, Traore stood. His movement was fluid, unhurried, carrying the confidence of a man who had found his truth in the red earth of his homeland. He walked to the window, gazing out at the compound where Burkinabe soldiers, his soldiers, stood guard under the blazing sun. "Honored generals," he began, his voice carrying the cadence of griots who had sung the histories of kingdoms before any European had set foot on African soil. "You speak of stability, of partnership, of legitimacy. But whose stability? Whose partnership? Whose legitimacy?" He turned back to face them, and something in his bearing had shifted. The respectful young captain was transforming before their eyes into something more primal, more connected to the ancient power that flowed through African veins. "I see before me warriors whose ancestors fought with Ashanti spears and Mandinka swords, who built empires that stretched from the Atlantic to the Nile while Europe wallowed in its dark ages. I see the children of Sundiata and Yaa Asantewaa, of Queen Zinga and Samori Touré. Yet you sit before me speaking the language of our colonizers, carrying their interests as if they were your own children." General Asante's jaw tightened. "Captain, you mistake pragmatism for betrayal. The world has changed. We must work within existing frameworks." "Frameworks built to cage lions and turn them into circus animals," Traore interrupted, his voice rising like the call of a muezzin at dawn. "Tell me, General Asante, when your grandfather fought the British in the Gold Coast, did he work within their framework? When your great-grandmother carried water to freedom fighters hiding in the forest, was she being pragmatic about colonial rule?" The room crackled with electric tension. No junior officer had ever spoken to these men with such directness, such absence of deference. Yet Traore continued, his words flowing like a river breaking through a dam. "You call yourselves African generals, but you enforce European interests. You wear our flags on your uniforms while serving foreign masters. You speak of African unity while dividing our continent into spheres of influence for non-African powers." General Diallo's face flushed with anger. "You dare question our patriotism? I have bled for African independence." "Have you?" Traore's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow filled the room more completely than any shout. "Or have you bled to replace white colonial administrators with black colonial administrators? Tell me, what has changed in Senegal since independence? Do your people control their uranium? Their fish? Their peanuts? Or do the same companies that exploited them under colonial rule continue to exploit them under your protection?" The truth hung in the air like tear gas, stinging eyes and constricting throats. Each general felt the weight of compromises they had made, of blind eyes they had turned, of their people's resources flowing out of Africa while their people remained in poverty. General Nyong stood, his bulk intimidating. "Enough. Do you think pretty speeches change reality? You think defiance feeds hungry children? We have tried revolution, boy. It leads to chaos, to civil war, to mass graves. We choose stability over ideology because we learned that ideological purity is a luxury poor people cannot afford." Traore nodded slowly, acknowledging the pain in the older man's words. "General Nyong, I hear your wisdom. I understand your fear. But tell me, has your stability brought prosperity to our people? Has your pragmatism lifted a single child out of malnutrition? Has your cooperation with foreign powers built a single school that teaches African children to be proud of their heritage?" He began to pace, his movement like that of a caged panther finally remembering its power. "You fear chaos, but what we have now is not order, it is organized exploitation. You fear civil war, but we are already at war, an economic war, a cultural war, a spiritual war against our own identity and dignity." General al-Rashid, who had remained silent, finally spoke. "And what would you have us do? Break every alliance? Destroy every treaty? Watch our economies collapse while you pursue some romantic vision of the African Renaissance?" Traore stopped pacing and faced her directly. Sister General, what I would have us do is remember who we are. Before we were Burkinabe or Ghanaian or Senegalese, we were African. Before we were French-speaking or English-speaking, we spoke Bambara and Wolof and Hausa. Before we measured our worth in European currencies, we measured it in the wisdom of our elders and the laughter of our children. His voice began to take on the rhythm of traditional praise singing, the oral tradition that had carried African history across centuries before writing existed on this continent. I would have us remember that Timbuktu was a center of learning when London was a collection of mud huts. I would have us remember that African kingdoms were built with stone and gold while Europe lived in wood and straw. I would have us remember that we traded with India and China across the Indian Ocean while Europeans thought the world was flat. The generals shifted uncomfortably. These were not the words of a deluded revolutionary, they were the words of a man drawing power from wells deeper than any foreign influence. But remembering the past is not enough, Traore continued, his voice building like summer thunder over the savannah. We must act on that memory. We must stop genuflecting to powers that see us as children to be managed rather than equals to be respected. General Asante leaned forward, his voice carrying decades of military authority. Captain, you speak beautifully, but beauty does not stop bullets. Beauty does not prevent coups. If you continue this path, you will end like Sankara, dead at 37 with your dreams buried in Burkinabe soil. The threat hung in the air like vultures circling carrion. At that moment, everyone in the room understood the true nature of this meeting. This was not consultation, it was a death sentence being delivered with diplomatic courtesy. Traore smiled, and something in that smile made the temperature in the room drop despite the African heat. General Asante, do you think Thomas Sankara died in vain? Do you think his ideas died with him? Look around this room, look at the portraits on these walls. Dead revolutionaries watching living collaborators. He walked to a portrait of Sankara, touching the frame with reverence. Thomas Sankara said that imperialism is a system of exploitation that occurs not only in the brutal form of those who come with guns to conquer territory. Imperialism often occurs in more subtle forms, a loan, food aid, or blackmail. He said we must produce what we consume and consume what we produce. Turning back to the generals, his voice rose to fill every corner of the room. That man you threatened me with, Thomas Sankara, he vaccinated 2.5 million children against measles, polio, and meningitis in his first year. He planted 10 million trees to halt desertification. He gave land to poor farmers and made Burkina Faso food self-sufficient. He banned female genital mutilation and polygamy. He appointed women to high government positions. The litany of accomplishments thundered through the room like an African drum ensemble, each achievement a counterpoint to the failures of pragmatic leadership. In 4 years, that failed revolution did more for ordinary Africans than most of our stable governments have done in decades. So yes, I would rather die like Sankara than live like those who killed him. General Diallo stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. This is pointless. The boy is drunk on his own rhetoric. We have delivered our message. The consequences are on his head. But Traore was not finished. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper, forcing the generals to strain to hear. Before you leave, honored elders, let me tell you what I see when I close my eyes. He closed his eyes, and his voice took on the otherworldly quality of a traditional seer speaking prophecy. I see children in Burkinabe villages learning to read in their own languages. I see farmers using techniques their grandfathers knew, techniques that sustained this land for thousands of years before chemical companies told them they needed foreign fertilizers to feed foreign crops. His eyes opened, bright with visions of possibility. I see young Africans in universities learning African history from African professors, not European interpretations of African experience. I see African currencies backed by African resources, African banks funding African development, African solutions to African problems. The generals listened despite themselves, caught in the hypnotic power of his words. I see an Africa where children grow up knowing they are descended from pharaohs and queens, from master builders and brilliant astronomers, from warriors who never bent the knee to foreign conquerors until treachery and superior weapons, not superior courage or intelligence, temporarily subdued them. General al-Rashid found herself leaning forward, drawn into the vision despite her better judgment. And how, Captain, do you propose to achieve this paradise while surrounded by hostile neighbors and suspicious allies? Traore smiled, and this time the smile held the warmth of African sunshine. The same way our ancestors built the pyramids, Sister General, one stone at a time, with patience and determination and unshakable faith in our ability to create greatness. He began walking around the table, his presence somehow filling the space beyond his physical dimensions. You ask about hostile neighbors? Every African nation that achieves true independence makes it easier for the next one. Every African leader who stands upright makes it harder for foreign powers to find African leaders willing to crawl. His hand touched the back of General Nyong's chair. You speak of economic collapse? Brother, we are already collapsed. We export raw materials and import finished goods. We send our brightest minds to European universities and they never return home. We measure our success by how much foreign investment we attract instead of how much domestic wealth we create. Moving to General Diallo's side, his voice took on the intimate quality of an elder teaching a beloved nephew. You fear chaos? What is more chaotic than watching your people die of diseases that could be prevented by medicine they cannot afford to buy from companies using resources extracted from their own land? Finally, he returned to his seat but remained standing. The 9 minutes he had been speaking felt like hours, as if time itself had bent to accommodate the weight of his words. Honored generals, you came here with an ultimatum. You expected to find a frightened young man who would accept your terms to save his own skin. Instead, you found something you did not expect, an African who has remembered how to be African. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the distant sound of Burkinabe children playing in the streets beyond the compound walls. Their laughter carried on the wind like the promise of future generations who might grow up free. General Asante cleared his throat, his voice lacking its earlier authority. Captain Traore, you have said your piece. History will judge whether your courage was wisdom or folly. As the generals prepared to leave, Traore spoke one final time. History is being written now, in this room, in this moment. Future generations of Africans will read about this day and ask themselves a simple question. When Africa stood at a crossroads between dignity and submission, between independence and neo-colonialism, between remembering who we are and forgetting who we were meant to be, which path did we choose? The generals filed out in silence, their earlier confidence replaced by something harder to define. As they walked through the compound, past the acacia trees and the red laterite pathways, each carried with them the echo of words that had shaken foundations they thought were unshakable. In their Mercedes convoys, rolling away from Ouagadougou as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, the generals sat in contemplative silence. They had come to deliver an ultimatum to a young captain. Instead, they had received something far more dangerous. A reminder of what they had once dreamed of becoming before the weight of pragmatism had bent their backs and bowed their heads. Behind them, in the presidential palace, Ibrahim Traore stood alone in the conference room, surrounded by the portraits of African heroes who had dared to dream of a continent free, proud, and united. The setting sun painted the walls gold, and in that golden light, the faces in the portraits seemed to nod in approval. 9 minutes had passed since he began speaking. 9 minutes that would ripple across West Africa and beyond, carrying the ancient power of African voices raised in defiance of those who would silence them. 9 minutes that reminded a continent what courage sounded like when it spoke in its own voice, with its own authority, drawing power from its own inexhaustible wells of dignity and strength. The young captain had not destroyed the generals with superior firepower or political maneuvering. He had destroyed their certainty, their comfortable assumption that African leadership would always bend to foreign pressure. He had destroyed their belief that pragmatism was more powerful than principle, that survival was more important than honor. Most dangerously of all, he had awakened something they thought had been safely buried with Africa's revolutionary generation, the memory of what it felt like to stand upright in a world that expected Africans to kneel. As night fell over Burkina Faso, the land of upright men, the words spoken in that conference room began their journey across the continent, carrying with them the promise that Africa's story was far from over, and its greatest chapters might yet be written by those who remembered how to dream with their ancestors' courage and speak with their ancestors' pride. The ultimatum had been delivered and received. But in the end, it was not Ibrahim Traore who had been destroyed by those 9 minutes of fire. It was the comfortable fiction that Africa's children would always accept the limitations others imposed upon their dreams.